That morning started like any other. I was up before the sun, wrapped in my soft gray robe, sipping dark roast from my favorite chipped mug while reviewing our pitch deck one last time. My name is Erin Lowell, co-founder of Haven Point Consulting, and that day was supposed to be the biggest moment of our firm's 8-year journey. Dylan, my husband and business partner, was upstairs getting ready. We had a final call with Phoenix Bridge at 10:30. If we landed this deal, everything would change. I felt nervous but proud. I'd spent 6 months pouring myself into this strategy. Every chart, every projection fine-tuned to speak to their deepest pain points. Dylan was the voice in the room, but the ideas were mine. I set my coffee down and reached for the tablet on the counter to check a client document I'd sent to myself. It wasn't mine, but Dylan often left it around. As I tapped the screen, a message notification slid into view. Not from a client, from Rachel, his assistant. The preview was just a sentence. This incompetent will finally embarrass herself. After this deal, I'm done with her. I froze. My thumb hovered, then pressed. The rest of the thread loaded. I didn't breathe. Her message was followed by laughing emojis and a gif I couldn't even process. I stared, eyes wide, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. The room fell silent. My pulse thundered in my ears. I read the words again and again, trying to make them mean something else. Maybe it was about someone else, a client, a mistake, something, anything. But then I saw how he'd saved her contact, just her first name with a little heart. My throat closed. I scrolled, slowly, carefully. Every message felt like a knife. They weren't just talking about work. They were talking about me, about the plan, about how I had no idea, how I was killing myself preparing this pitch while they were planning a future without me, jokes about my late nights, how I was too naive to see what was coming. Rachel had written, "She actually thinks this will save her spot." He replied, "After this, I finally get to cut the dead weight." That was me, the dead weight. My hand was trembling, but I forced it to place the tablet back exactly as it had been. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at the sink, willing myself to breathe. A few seconds later, I heard Dylan coming down the stairs. His voice was casual, light, asking if I wanted eggs. I turned, smiled, said I was fine with toast. My voice was steady, my hands were not. We stood in that kitchen like everything was normal. He kissed my cheek. I kissed him back. And somewhere deep inside, I felt something inside me go still. Not dead, just cold. That was the moment I realized I was alone in a business meant for two. I stood in the middle of the kitchen with Dylan's tablet still glowing in my hands. The blue light cast shadows on the countertop, but all I could see were the words that kept stabbing deeper with every scroll. I don't know why I kept reading. Maybe part of me hoped I'd misunderstood, that the first message was just a terrible joke, but it wasn't. There were months of them, plans, timelines, strategy calls between him and Rachel that never included me. They talked about investors I'd never heard about and documents I wasn't copied on. They discussed how after Phoenix Bridge signed, they'd restructure the leadership roles, make it look natural, quiet, like I'd chosen to step away. I read one thread twice. He'd told Rachel he was already prepping the board to think of me as emotional and stretched too thin. Another one. He'd said my attention to detail made me great with execution, but not big picture thinking. Rachel responded that once the deal closed, they'd finally be able to run the company without someone who slowed things down with all her questions. That was the part that did it. I felt the shift inside me. The ache pulled tight and then gave way to something else. Not rage, not yet, but awareness. Like I was suddenly standing outside my own life, watching someone peel away the version I thought was real. I kept scrolling. A message from 2 weeks ago read, "She's still working on the pitch deck at 1 a.m. Like clockwork. She thinks this will prove her value." Rachel had replied, "Let her dig her own grave." And then, beneath it, a photo. Me. From the doorway. Sitting at the dining table, hunched over my laptop. She must have taken it when she dropped off documents that night. They were mocking me in real time. I set the tablet down so gently it didn't even click against the counter. My hands were ice. My heartbeat had settled into a quiet thud, steady and dull. I looked around the kitchen, the pan on the stove, the 2 coffee mugs waiting to be filled, the hand towel slung over the oven door. It all looked the same, but none of it felt familiar anymore. That was when I realized he hadn't just betrayed me as his wife. He'd rewritten the story of our company, of who I was inside it. I wasn't his partner. I was the support staff, the background noise he used to make himself look more impressive. All those nights I stayed up building models, checking projections, reworking the margins to make them airtight. All those weekends I sacrificed, believing we were in it together. He'd taken that work and used it as his foundation to climb higher without me. The front door creaked, footsteps overhead, the shower turning off. I stood frozen, trying to pull my face into something soft, something neutral. I didn't have the luxury of reaction. Not yet. I needed to be calm. If I exploded now, he'd deny everything, spin it back onto me, or worse, tighten whatever trap they'd been setting. Dylan came downstairs humming to himself, fresh from the shower, hair still damp. He smiled when he saw me, walked over and kissed my forehead like it was any other morning. I nodded and handed him his coffee. He sipped it, complimented the aroma, said we were going to crush it today. My stomach clenched. I smiled back, said something about being proud of our work. My voice sounded normal even to me. That scared me a little. I'd never been this good at pretending before, but now something in me had clicked into place. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. Not while the stakes were this high. He sat at the island, opened his laptop, and started reviewing his speaking notes. I watched him, really watched. The ease in his posture, the quiet arrogance in how he glanced at the slides like he'd written them. I'd memorized every one of those slides. I knew them inside and out. I had built that pitch line by line, anticipating every investor objection. He hadn't contributed to a single analytic, but he was going to present it like it was his. I stirred my coffee and nodded while he spoke. On the outside, I was the same Erin I'd always been, supportive, calm, smiling. But inside, I wasn't trying to save what we had anymore. I was calculating what it would take to walk away without leaving anything behind. I already knew I wouldn't say a word. I would let him play out the rest of his part in this little show. Because if he thought I was the dead weight, he clearly hadn't considered what happened when the one holding it all together decided to let go. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even look at him differently. I simply nodded when Dylan mentioned he'd follow up with the Phoenix Bridge investors later in the day and said I'd double-check our numbers one more time. Then I took my laptop, walked upstairs, and closed the door to my office with a quiet click. The first thing I did was call Kara Whitmore. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was the sharpest corporate strategist I knew. I'd worked with her years ago on a client's acquisition deal and trusted her instincts without question. I told her I needed to establish IP protections, review ownership rights, and prepare for a potential separation of business interests. I didn't explain why. She didn't ask. She just said she'd clear her afternoon. Next, I logged into our shared accounting software. I downloaded every document I could find that showed my financial contributions, the client contracts I'd led, and the proprietary strategy models I'd designed. I flagged every version of our Phoenix Bridge pitch to show the version history. I backed up files in 2 locations, one cloud-based, one encrypted local. Each time I clicked save, I felt a little steadier. By mid-morning, I was going through our shared Dropbox folders and marking anything that had originated from my drive. I had documentation on every template, every spreadsheet. The frameworks we built our reputation on came from years of my planning. Dylan had charm and polish, but charm didn't write 5-year rollout projections. Before I closed my browser, I downloaded a basic audio recording app, nothing flashy. Just a reliable background program that would quietly run during video calls. I enabled it, tested it, then tucked it into the folder with today's client prep materials. My plan wasn't revenge, it was survival. I paused, looked around my office. On the shelf were the binders I'd built when we first launched Haven Point, handwritten notes, market analyses, all mine. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt in the same way. Something deeper had taken over, like a quiet voice saying, "Prepare now. You won't get a second chance." When I came back downstairs, Dylan was scrolling through a pitch rehearsal checklist. He looked up and smiled, asked if I wanted lunch. I told him I was too focused to eat. He shrugged and returned to his screen. He still believed this was his moment, that I was just the one holding the ladder while he climbed. I let him believe it. Because the truth was, I wasn't trying to stop him anymore. I was simply stepping aside and documenting every rung he thought was his. Dylan brought the mugs in with both hands, smiling like it was a special morning. He placed one in front of me, steam curling in soft ribbons from the surface. Dark roast. Exactly how I liked it. He watched me for a second too long, then picked up his own and sat down across from me. His tone was casual. He mentioned something about timing the Q&A section, asked if I'd double-check the financial slide again. I nodded, answered, reached for my mug, but something didn't sit right. His energy was too polished, too smooth. I'd seen that look before, right before a client pitch where he'd rehearsed every word. When he stood and said he needed to run to the bathroom, I didn't hesitate. I waited until I heard the door click upstairs. Then I reached across the table and switched the mugs. His went in front of me, mine in front of him. The handles still pointed in the direction we'd each expect. No evidence anything had changed. I sat back down and folded my hands in my lap. A few minutes passed. The house was quiet except for the faint buzz of the fridge. I took a sip from what had been his cup. The taste was fine, normal, but I watched the door as I drank, calm and still, letting the silence stretch. He came back a few minutes later, refreshed and humming, picked up the cup that was now mine and took a long drink, then smiled like everything was perfectly in place. I smiled back, said nothing. I didn't need to. Because now I wasn't just preparing, I was ready. At exactly 10:30, the Phoenix Bridge logo filled our screen. One by one, their cameras flickered on. The CEO, David Langston, nodded politely. Beside him sat two other senior partners and a woman from their analytics team. Dylan straightened in his chair, cleared his throat, and greeted everyone with practiced ease. He thanked them for their time, said we were honored to present. His voice was steady, confident. At first, he clicked to the opening slide and launched into our positioning strategy. But then he paused, blinked, looked down at his notes, and repeated a phrase he'd already said. No one said anything. The partners watched politely. David leaned forward. Dylan smiled again, a little tighter this time. He moved to the second slide. Read the first line wrong, corrected himself, then stumbled on the name of one of their subsidiaries. I felt it, the shift. Small but there. He kept going, talking about market alignment and operational efficiency, but he repeated himself again. His pacing slowed. There was a moment where he stared at a number on the screen like it didn't make sense. I saw him blink hard, twice, and then take a sip from his coffee. Across the table, I sat perfectly still. I nodded in support, took notes like nothing was wrong, but inside, I was counting the seconds. One mistake was human. Two could be forgiven. But by the time he misread our second-year ROI projection and called it a first-year estimate, I saw the partners shift. David glanced down at his notebook. The woman on the end tilted her head. Dylan kept talking, but his voice had flattened. Less sure. His hands were fidgeting now. I saw the slight shake when he reached again for his coffee. He smiled, but his eyes were dull. The lines on his forehead were deeper than I remembered. He clicked forward and the screen froze for a second. When it came back, he had skipped a slide. He went back, then forward again. His rhythm was gone. He was drifting, just slightly. But in a room like this, slightly was all it took. I folded my hands and waited, not for him to fail, but for the moment when I would need to step in, not to rescue him, to protect the work, because no matter what he'd planned, this was still my strategy, and I wasn't going to let him drag it down with him. I leaned forward just slightly and smiled toward the camera. Then I spoke, slow and sure. I thanked them for their time again and explained that I'd walk through the next section while Dylan regrouped. My tone was warm, calm. I didn't mention the stumbles. I didn't need to. The slide on screen showed a breakdown of projected efficiency gains. I explained how we'd benchmarked similar firms post-acquisition and mapped those patterns to Phoenix Bridge's current structure. I clicked to the next graph. Growth curves, forecast accuracy, measurable savings over a 24-month span. Every number I shared was anchored in something I had built. The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable. David raised his head. The analyst leaned in. One of the partners began to jot down notes. I spoke clearly, offering comparisons and short anecdotes from similar projects we'd handled last year. Not one detail was improvised. This wasn't a rescue. It was a return to what should have been happening from the beginning. Behind me, I heard Dylan shift. A soft exhale. I didn't turn. I kept my focus on the screen, on the team, on the value we were delivering. When one of the partners asked a sharp follow-up, I was already ready with the answer. That's where my confidence lived. In the preparation, in the truth. Dylan tried to jump in once, but his voice cracked. He reached for his coffee again and missed the handle slightly before correcting. Then he fell quiet. I answered the next few questions without pause, laid out our implementation roadmap, each phase backed with cost and personnel estimates. I could see them nodding now, not out of politeness, out of understanding. As I clicked to the final section, the room felt different. The tension had shifted. They weren't worried anymore. They were engaged. I smiled, relaxed into the moment. I mentioned how we structured weekly reporting, how we guaranteed transparency through every milestone. When I wrapped the summary, David looked at me with something close to admiration. He said it was some of the most grounded strategic thinking they'd seen. I thanked him, genuinely. Not for the compliment, for seeing what was real, for seeing me. I glanced at Dylan, just once. His face was pale, hands gripped tight around his mug. But I said nothing. I didn't need to. The work had spoken, and the room had listened. Dylan shifted in his chair again and reached to advance the slides. But his hand hovered too long over the mouse. He clicked the wrong icon, closed the presentation, and stared at the screen like it had betrayed him. There was a beat of silence. I gently reached across and reopened the file, shared my screen with the call, said something light about technical glitches being part of the fun. David Langston gave a tight smile, but his eyes were fixed on Dylan now. Dylan cleared his throat and tried to jump back in. His words came out uneven, slurred at the edges. He mixed up two department names and had to backtrack. I stepped in again, covered with a transition, answered the question he missed without ever pointing to the gap. The questions kept coming, one about risk mitigation, another about onboarding procedures. I handled both with quiet precision, quoted stats from our case studies, referred to process maps I'd designed from scratch. The partners started nodding again. One of them leaned in and said, "You built this structure." I smiled and said yes. My voice didn't change. My expression stayed even. But inside, something settled, like a weight I'd carried for years had finally shifted off my chest. Dylan tried one more time, a closing statement. He started a sentence, lost his train of thought, blinked hard, and mumbled something about strategic velocity. Then silence. His face was pale now, his hands resting awkwardly on the table, fingers twitching slightly. I let the moment breathe, then moved forward. We still had 3 final slides. I walked through each one with the same steady rhythm, spoke about projected growth, showed the 3-phase rollout, highlighted key metrics for post-integration success. By the last slide, the tone in the virtual room had changed completely. David leaned forward and said the projections were not just ambitious, but deeply grounded. I thanked him, said we believed in delivering what we promised. The analyst asked who would be the point person for implementation. I answered without hesitation. I would be. No one looked at Dylan. Not anymore. He sat quietly, his eyes down, nodding slowly like he couldn't quite follow. He looked small, not because he was weak, because the room no longer needed him. As I ended the call, David said we'd hear from them soon. He thanked both of us, but his final comment was clear. "Erin, this was exceptional. We're looking forward to speaking further." The screen went dark. I sat still for a moment, letting the silence return. Dylan turned his head toward me, his eyes unfocused. He said he didn't know what was happening, that he'd felt fine that morning. I nodded, said maybe he was just overworked. Then I stood, walked into the kitchen, and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. He had watched me all morning, waiting for me to collapse. But it was him who fell. Dylan sat hunched at the kitchen table, blinking slowly like he had just come out of a storm. He looked at me with glassy eyes and asked what had happened. His voice was quiet, uncertain, stripped of its usual swagger. I knelt beside him, resting a hand lightly on his arm, told him it was probably exhaustion, that he'd been pushing too hard, that he should lie down for a bit. He nodded, still dazed, and shuffled off to the bedroom without another word. The moment the door clicked shut, I stood up and wiped my hand on a towel. My phone was already in my hand. I texted my attorney to confirm our meeting for later that day. Then I opened my laptop and began forwarding critical documents to a secure drive. Every file I'd touched, every piece of strategy I'd written, every financial sheet with my initials at the bottom. I called the bank next, requested the records for our business account, and began drafting a ledger of my personal contributions. I asked the receptionist at our shared office suite to redirect all future calls to my personal cell. Calm, clean, controlled. He thought I'd been building something for us. He never realized I'd already built it for myself. The company, the reputation, the client relationships. I hadn't just survived what he tried to do to me. I'd documented it, preserved it, transformed it into leverage. In the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection. No makeup, hair pulled back, still in my blazer from the meeting. But my eyes were clear. There was no fear left in them, just focus and time. Everything I needed now was just a matter of execution. At 4 o'clock, I sat across from my attorney, Rebecca, in her office near downtown. I handed her a folder thick with screenshots, printed emails, and copies of our partnership agreement. Her expression shifted as she flipped through the pages. By the time she reached the section about Dylan's messages to Rachel, her eyebrows had lifted halfway to her hairline. She asked a few sharp questions. I answered every one, calm, direct. She said we had more than enough to begin proceedings. I nodded and signed the engagement letter without hesitation. Then I asked for help drafting a formal letter to Dylan, asserting my sole ownership of all strategic work developed under my name. From there, I moved with purpose. I walked to the bank across the street and opened a new business account, transferred every dollar I could prove had come from my consulting fees or my personal capital. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start fresh. The manager gave me the paperwork with a crisp envelope. I slipped it into my bag without a word. Back at home, Dylan was still asleep. I padded past the bedroom in silence and sat down at my desk. I opened a blank email and typed slowly. "Thank you for today's opportunity. I would be honored to continue as your lead consultant moving forward. If there are additional documents you need from me, I'm available at this direct email and number." I signed it alone. I attached the revised presentation with my solo branding at the footer. Then I sent it. The message read clean, professional, but anyone with sense could feel the shift it carried. The balance of power had tilted, and it wasn't going back. Next, I made copies of every strategy document with timestamps. My name appeared on each draft, each outline, each pitch. Then I compiled my development notes for past projects, labeled, sorted, and stored them in the new drive. This wasn't about proving who'd worked harder. It was about building a trail so clear no one could mistake who the mind behind the company really was. Outside the window, dusk had started to fall. I closed the blinds and lit the small lamp on my desk. The glow was soft. My hands were steady. Dylan was still asleep in the other room, unaware that while he dreamed, I had already taken back everything he thought was his. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I simply filed the last document, closed the folder, and sat still for a moment. The war was never loud. It was a series of quiet moves, and I had just played them all. 6 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking downtown Denver. The early sunlight spilled through the windows, warming the floor where my dog was curled up, asleep. The hum of quiet keyboards and muted phone calls came from beyond the glass wall where my team worked calmly, confidently. Haven Point Consulting had grown by 35%. We'd landed 2 more long-term contracts after Phoenix Bridge, both referrals based on that single meeting. The numbers looked good, but it wasn't the spreadsheets that gave me satisfaction. It was knowing I'd rebuilt everything without needing to tear someone else down in the process. Dylan hadn't fought the settlement. Once Rebecca laid out the recordings, the financial history, and the witness notes from the investors, his lawyer had quietly advised him to walk away. He signed the dissolution papers 3 weeks later, and I haven't seen him since. Word around the business circles was that he tried freelancing in a nearby city, but hadn't found any traction. Rachel's story ended even sooner. The screenshots of her messages with Dylan had been sent to her licensing board the same week I submitted the legal complaint. Her credential was suspended pending review, and I heard from a former client that she'd left the consulting field altogether. I didn't celebrate, I just noted it. A chapter closed. People always ask if I feel like I won. I don't know how to answer that. I didn't win something that day. I reclaimed it, my work, my name, my power. The part of me I'd given away too freely because I believed partnership meant sacrifice. It doesn't, not when sacrifice is one-sided. Every part of the Phoenix Bridge rollout exceeded expectations. Our implementation team hit every milestone. Their quarterly reports showed measurable growth within the first 90 days. When David called to say they'd be renewing the contract for 2 more years, I thanked him with the same level voice I'd used during the meeting that started it all. I don't think I'll ever forget that morning. The mugs, the careful switch, the way he looked at me, so sure I had no idea what he was planning. I did. I knew more than he ever imagined. But I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there, smiled, and picked up the right cup. People think power is loud, but real power is quiet. It doesn't demand the room. It just becomes the room. I learned that by watching someone try to steal my voice while underestimating my silence. Most evenings, I leave the office around 6. I walk home through the Capitol Hill neighborhood with a coffee in hand. The same path I used to take years ago when we were building the business from our spare bedroom. Back then, I used to wonder if it would all be worth it, if the late nights and sacrificed weekends would lead to anything that felt solid. Now I know they did, just not in the way I expected. The success didn't come from fighting for recognition. It came from stopping, breathing, and remembering who I was before I let someone else define my value. I've grown more in these last 6 months than in the previous 6 years. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't picked up that iPad, if I hadn't seen that message. Maybe I would have walked into that meeting, oblivious, and handed over the credit for everything I'd built. Maybe I would have smiled while he erased me in real time. But fate gave me a glimpse, and I listened. The real revenge wasn't the ruined career or the severed relationship. It was waking up every day, walking into this space I designed, and doing what I do best, on my terms, with no one speaking over me, no one taking credit, just me, in full command of the life I almost let slip away. I don't think I'll ever trust blindly again, but I haven't hardened. I've just learned to look more closely, ask more questions, pay attention to what's unsaid, and above all else, know where my cup is. Because in the end, that's what saved me. I didn't scream, I didn't lash out. I simply made sure I drank from the right cup and let him drink from the one he poured. The hardest part wasn't finding out what he planned. It was realizing how much of myself I had given to someone who never truly saw me. I'd spent years showing up, doing the real work, believing that loyalty and love were enough to protect something we'd built together. But he never wanted a partner. He wanted a shadow, and I let myself become one for far too long. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal. It was the quiet moment when I saw how far I'd drifted from my own worth. Taking back my power wasn't loud or angry. It was slow, intentional. It was remembering my name in every document, my voice in every idea. And finally, trusting myself to lead without apology. Now, I wake up without fear. I sit in rooms I earned my way into. I speak and I'm heard. Not because I forced my way in, but because I stopped giving others the right to decide if I belonged. So let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? And if you have, how would you take back your power?